Donald Trump's alarming threat to acquire Canada.
Doubling down on his desire for Canada to become the 51st state.
Canada's Mark Carney has appeared with President Trump at the White House, and there were at times tetchy exchanges over tariffs and over Mr. Trump's repeated calls for Canada to become the 51st state of the US.
Sir Lopez, you said you were considering military force to acquire Panama and Greenland. Are you also considering military force to annex and acquire Canada?
No, economic force. Because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
The Western alliance looks like a rope in a tug-of-war. America pulling on one end, Europe on the other. And right in the middle is Canada, a country forced to decide which way it will lean as the pressure mounts. But this isn't just about Ottawa. This tug-of-war could reshape the balance of power across the world. Look across the Atlantic, and the cracks are hard to ignore. What stands out to me is how Washington keeps turning up the pressure on energy, on defense, on trade. Trump's message to Europe couldn't be clearer. Spend more on NATO or risk America walking away. And here's the thing. The push doesn't end with defense. The US is leaning on Europe to buy American energy, instead of relying on Russia or the Middle East. From Brussels' point of view, that feels less like partnership and more like being boxed in. But in my view, this fight isn't just about budgets or gas pipelines, it's about power, about who actually leads the West. For decades, that answer was obvious: America. Today, Europe is signaling that it's not so simple anymore. They're building up their own defenses, signing new energy deals, and showing they won't always take orders from Washington. To me, the result is clear. A rivalry is simmering inside the very alliance that once defined global security. This is where things get really interesting, because Canada is stuck right in the middle of this fight. On one hand, its economy is so deeply tied to the US that even a small tariff can feel like a blow in the neck. When Trump slapped tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum overnight, Canadian workers and industries felt the shock. It wasn't just numbers. It was jobs, livelihoods, real people. But here's the thing. Canada doesn't want to look like it's just nodding along to Washington's tune. There's pride, there's sovereignty. Ottawa has always tried to play this careful balancing act, staying close to America, but still holding on to its own independent voice. And lately, that balancing act feels more like walking a tightrope. When Washington turns up the heat on trade or energy, Canada feels cornered. But when Europe pushes back against Trump, Canada sees an opening. Closer ties with Brussels, new trade opportunities, even a chance to prove it doesn't have to choose just one side. Honestly, it feels like Canada is standing on a fault line, pulled in two directions, knowing that whichever way it leans, the ground could crack beneath its feet. Here's where the story really lands. Canada is stuck smack in the middle of a tug-of-war, and the stakes couldn't be higher. On one side is the US imposing steep tariffs that don't just sting, they hit hard. Take steel and aluminum, for instance. Trump doubled tariffs to 50%, putting Canada's $15 billion Canadian dollar steel sector, which supports over 100,000 jobs, directly in the crosshairs. Ontario and Quebec, home to most of that industry, felt the pain fast. Then there's the economy-wide fallout, Yale's budget lab projects. Canada's GDP could shrink by 2.1% in the long run, worse than any other country, thanks to the drag from tariffs, especially since 75% of Canadian exports head to the US and include heavy hits on energy, autos, and basic goods. That's not just numbers, it's livelihoods. And the response? Canada slapped back with its own 29.8 billion Canadian dollars in retaliatory tariffs, covering steel, aluminum, and other US goods. But the tension runs deeper than trade. Canada doesn't want to look like it's just echoing Washington's agenda. Sovereignty matters, Ottawa is caught trying to stay close enough to benefit economically, but independent enough to stay true to its values. That balancing act? It feels like walking a tightrope, especially when manufacturing regions like Ontario and Quebec depend on the U.S. for 42% of their demand, supporting nearly 688,000 jobs. Yet, when Europe pushes back, offering trade alternatives, defense pacts, and energy deals, Canada sees opportunity. It's a chance to redefine itself not just as America's neighbor, but as a global partner reshaping the Western alliance. Honestly, it feels like Canada is standing on a geological fault, pulled both ways, knowing that whatever direction it leans, the ground beneath could shift without warning. When I look at Canada's next move, it feels less like hesitation and more like quiet repositioning. Step by step, Ottawa is leaning toward Europe, almost like it's hedging against an unpredictable America. Take defense, for example. In 2024, Canada signed a defense cooperation pact with the EU, the first of its kind outside Europe. That's historic. It means Canada isn't just relying on NATO under US leadership anymore, it's carving out direct military ties with Brussels. And with Trump demanding NATO members hit 2% of GDP on defense spending, a bar Canada hasn't met, it's not hard to see why Ottawa is looking for new security partners. Energy is another big play. Europe is desperate to cut dependence on Russian gas, and Canada is stepping in. Last year, Canada exported $21.2 billion in energy products to the EU, from LNG to uranium, and projects like the LNG Newfoundland facility are being pitched directly at European markets. Ottawa even signed deals with Germany to ship green hydrogen by 2025, a symbolic move showing Europe is now more than just a backup customer. And here's the kicker: rare earths. The minerals powering everything from smartphones to fighter jets are suddenly a geopolitical weapon. China controls about 60% of global production, but Canada has reserves ranked in the world's top 5. In 2023, Canada signed agreements with Germany and France to supply critical minerals, directly cutting into Beijing's leverage and cementing Europe as a priority partner. To me, this doesn't look like Canada abandoning the US, not yet. It looks more like Canada is building an insurance policy, a safety net. Because if Washington under Trump keeps playing hardball with tariffs and NATO threats, Ottawa doesn't want to be caught with no alternatives. In a way, it's like Canada is keeping one foot planted in the American camp, but the other is already stepping onto Europe's stage. And the more pressure Trump applies, the further that step might go. When I step back and look at the bigger picture, Canada's choices don't just stop at its borders. They ripple out across the entire Western alliance. Take NATO. If Canada leans more heavily on Europe, it strengthens the EU's hand inside an alliance that has always been US-led. But that shift also exposes NATO's weakest spot: money. Right now, only 11 of NATO's 32 members hit the 2% defense spending target. Canada sits at just 1.37% of GDP, one of the lowest in the alliance. For Trump, that's proof Ottawa is freeloading. For Europe, it's a reminder that if America pulls back, they'll need Canada on their side to make NATO viable. Then there's the global economy. Canada's new energy and mineral deals don't just secure European supply, they cut into US leverage. Washington has used its LNG exports, now over 86 million metric tons in 2023, as a geopolitical tool, especially in Europe. But if Europe builds long-term supply chains with Canada, America's bargaining chip gets smaller, and that changes the balance of power in transatlantic trade. And of course, the rivals are watching. China and Russia see every crack in the Western Front as an opportunity. Russia benefits if NATO divides. It keeps pressure off Moscow in Ukraine. China benefits if Canada and Europe pivot together on critical minerals, because Beijing's near monopoly starts to erode. Already, Chinese state media is pointing to Canada's EU outreach as proof that the West is splintering. So, when Canada signs a deal in Berlin or a pact in Brussels, it's not just paperwork, it's a signal. A signal that America might not be the only leader of the West anymore. And every step Ottawa takes toward Europe forces Washington to ask, is Canada still fully in our corner? Or is it quietly redrawing the map of Western alliances? So, where does this all go? To me, it feels like the West is standing at a crossroads. On one path, we see more division. Trump has already hinted that if allies don't meet NATO spending, the U.S. might not defend them. Imagine that.
The military, they're not protected at all. And the reason is they think we're going to protect them.
The world's most powerful military openly questioning its security guarantees. If that happens, Europe could double down on building its own army, its own energy systems, and its own foreign policy, leaving America more isolated. Canada, caught in the middle, would have to choose which side of the Atlantic it leans toward. On the other path, though, this tension could force a new kind of balance. Europe and Canada aren't trying to throw Washington out. They're trying to make the West less dependent on a single capital. Some analysts call it strategic autonomy. Think of it like spreading the weight, so the rope doesn't snap under the strain. If Canada and Europe take on more responsibility, the alliance could actually become more resilient. But let's be honest, the uncertainty alone is already reshaping global politics. NATO unity is what has kept Russia in check since 2022. Western energy cooperation is what kept Europe warm after Moscow cut off gas. If that unity cracks, powers like China and Russia won't hesitate to exploit it. So the real question isn't just whether Canada sides with Trump or with Europe. It's whether the West can adapt to a world where American dominance is no longer a given. And that's a future that affects all of us, far beyond Ottawa, Brussels, or Washington. When I look at all this, it's clear that Canada's dilemma isn't really just about tariffs, energy, or defense spending. It's about something much bigger, the future of the West itself. For decades, the world assumed the U.S. will always make countries follow its dictates. We might be looking at a new era where power is shared between allies rather than dictated to them. That raises a bigger question. Is this the West falling apart, or simply evolving into something different? History shows us that alliances don't break overnight. They fracture slowly, and often in ways people don't notice until it's too late. Maybe that's what's happening now. So the debate isn't just Canada versus Trump, or Canada versus Europe. It's about whether the idea of a united West can even survive in a world that's moving toward multipolar power.